Sword of Bori. Dalinsia the Cimmerian was restless. She had been serving as a mercenary in the army of King Typhus of Brythunia for months, but she found the life of a soldier boring and unrewarding. She longed for more excitement and adventure. She despised the pompous and cowardly nobles who commanded her. She had made some friends among her fellow mercenaries, especially Arata, a red-headed pirate from Singera, but she also made some enemies, such as Prince Cluin, the king's arrogant and cruel son. One day, Dalinsia and Arata were summoned to the king's tent. They wondered what they had done to earn the king's attention and hoped it was not something bad. They entered the tent and saw King Typhus sitting on the throne, surrounded by his guards and advisors. The king was a fat, balding man, with a weak chin and a greedy eye. He wore a crown of gold and jewels, a robe of pure purple silk. He looked at Dalinsia and Arata with a smirk. "Ah, here they are," he said, "the two bravest and most loyal women in my army, or so I have heard." Dalinsia and Arata bowed their heads, not knowing what to say. "Your Majesty," Arata said. "Your Grace," said Dalinsia. The king nodded. "You have served me well in my wars against Nemedia and Corinthia. You have fought with courage and skill, and have brought me spoils and captives. You have earned my favor and gratitude." Dalinsia and Arata felt a surge of hope. Maybe the king was going to reward them with gold or lands or servants. But you have also earned my trust," the king continued, that is why I've chosen you for a special mission, a mission of great importance and danger, a mission that only you can accomplish." Dalinsia and Arata exchanged glances. They wondered what the king had in mind. "What is this mission, your Majesty?" Arata asked. The king leaned forward and lowered his voice. "I want you to find the Sword of Bori." Dalinsia and Arata gasped. They had heard the Sword of Bori, but they thought it was only a legend. The Sword of Bori was said to be a weapon of the first Hyborian king, who had led his people out of the frozen north after a cataclysm that destroyed Atlantis and Lemuria. The sword was forged by the gods themselves and imbued with their power. It was said that whoever wielded the sword could command the elements, summon storms, and strike down enemies with lightning. The sword was also said to be cursed, for it brought death and destruction to those who sought it, or used it for evil purposes. The Sword of Bori had been lost for centuries, hidden in some secret place or buried in some forgotten tomb. Many kings and heroes searched for it, but none had ever found it. Some have died in their quest, and others had gone mad or turned evil. The sword was a mystery and a menace, a dream and a nightmare. Now King Typhus wanted Dalinsia and Arata to find it for him. "Why do you want the sword, your Majesty?" Dalinsia asked. The king smiled wickedly. "Because I want to be master of the world," he said. "With the sword in my hand, I will crush all my enemies, conquer all the lands, and rule over all the peoples. I will be the greatest king that ever lived, greater than Bori herself." Dalinsia felt a chill in her spine. She realized that King Typhus was mad with ambition and greed. He did not care about his people or his kingdom, only about his glory and his power. He would use the sword for evil, not for good. He would bring war and chaos to the world, not peace and order. He wanted Dalinsia and Arata to help him. "How do you expect us to find the sword?" Arata asked. The king reached under his throne and pulled out an old scroll. "This is the ancient map that I acquired from a Zamorian thief," he said. "It shows the location of an old temple in the jungle beyond Hyperborea. According to legend, this temple was built by Bori himself and as a shrine to the god Grom, and inside the temple lies the Sword of Bori." He unrolled the scroll and showed it to Dalinsia and Arata. It was faded and torn, but they could see a crude drawing of a stone building surrounded by trees and vines. "This is where you must go," the king said. "You must travel through Hyperborea, across the swamp, and enter the jungle. You must find the temple, enter it, and retrieve the sword. You must bring it back to me, and I will reward you with riches and honors beyond your wildest dreams." Dalinsia and Arata looked at each other. They knew that the mission was a fool's errand, a suicide mission. They knew that Hyperborea was a land of savages and monsters, and that the swamp was a place of disease and death, and that the jungle was a realm of mystery and horror. They knew that the temple was probably guarded by traps and curses, and the sword was probably protected by some terrible guardian. They knew that even if they managed to find the sword and bring it back, the king would probably betray them and kill them. They knew that they had no choice. "Your Majesty," they said in unison, "we accept." "Good," the king said. "You will leave at dawn. Take whatever you need for the journey, but travel light and fast. Do not tell anyone where you are going or what you are doing. Do not fail me, or you will regret it." He dismissed them with a wave of his hand. Dalinsia and Arata left the tent feeling a mix of fear and anger. "What do we do now?" Arata said. "We do as he says," Dalinsia said. "We find the sword. And then what?" Dalinsia grinned. "Then we use it against him." Dalinsia and Arata set off on their perilous quest, facing many dangers and hardships. Along the way, they fought their way through the frozen lands of Hyperborea, where they encountered fierce barbarians and giant wolves. They crossed the swamps where they were attacked by crocodiles and leeches. They entered the jungle where they were stalked by panthers and pythons. And finally, they reached the temple where they found the Sword of Bori. The temple was a massive structure of stone covered with carvings and statues of ancient gods and heroes. It was surrounded by a wall of thorns, which Dalinsia and Arata had to cut through with their swords. They entered the temple through a large gate which was guarded by 2 stone lions. They explored the temple looking for the sword, but they found only empty rooms and dusty corridors. They wondered if the map was wrong, or if someone had already taken the sword. They came to a large hall which was filled with pillars and torches. In the center of the hall there was a pedestal on which lay a sword. It was a magnificent weapon. It was a blade of shining steel and a hilt of gold and jewels. It radiated a strange light, and it seemed to hum with power. Dalinsia and Arata approached the sword cautiously, feeling a sense of awe and dread. They reached for the sword, but before they could touch it, they heard a loud roar. They turned around and saw a huge lizard-like creature emerge from behind a pillar. It had green scales, yellow eyes, and sharp teeth. It had 4 legs, 2 arms, and a long tail. It wore a helmet and armor of bronze. It carried a shield and a spear. It was a lizard man, one of the ancient enemies of the Hyborians. The lizard man charged at Dalinsia and Arata, swinging its spear. Dalinsia and Arata dodged its attack and countered with their swords. A fierce battle ensued, and the 3 warriors clashed in the hall. The lizard man was strong and fast, but Dalinsia and Arata were skilled and brave. They parried his blows and wounded him with their blades. The lizard man roared in pain and anger and threw his shield at Dalinsia. Dalinsia ducked under the shield, but it hit one of the torches on the wall, causing it to fall on the floor. The torch ignited some dry leaves and wood that were scattered around the hall, creating a fire. The fire spread quickly, engulfing the hall in flames. The heat and smoke made it hard to breathe and see. Dalinsia and Arata realized that they had to escape before they were burned alive. They ran towards the gate, but they saw that it was blocked by another lizard man who had followed them into the temple. He was bigger and more armored than the first one, and he carried a sword that looked like the Sword of Bori. He was the Lizard King, the leader of the lizard men. He raised his sword in the air and shouted in a hissing voice, "Die, Hyborians! Die for your insolence! Die for your trespassing! Die for your theft!" He swung his sword at Dalinsia and Arata, barely managed to block it with their swords. The Lizard King's sword was powerful and magical. and it sent sparks flying when it clashed with their swords. Dalinsia and Arata fought back with all their strength, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. The Lizard King was too strong for them to overcome. They knew that they were doomed. But then they heard a chanting of a spell. They looked up and saw a black-haired beauty. It was Magda, the Stygian. Magda's spell transformed her into a dragon. It was a huge beast of scale and fire, with wings and claws and fangs. It had red eyes that glowed with a fury. Magda was an ally of Dalinsia's. Magda was a sorceress rogue that Dalinsia had befriended in one of her previous adventures. Magda had followed Dalinsia's trail from Hyperborea to the temple and arrived just in time to save her. Magda flew over the hall, breathed fire at the Lizard King and his minion. The lizard men screamed as they were burned by the dragon's flame. They dropped their weapons and ran for their lives, leaving behind the Sword of Bori. Dalinsia and Arata seized the opportunity and grabbed the sword. They thanked Magda for her help and mounted her back. They flew away from the temple, which was now a blazing inferno. They escaped with the sword and headed back to Brythunia to face King Typhus. They would use the sword against the king, and they would free the land from his tyranny.